we have Dr. Lawrence Madin from the Woods Hole Oceanographic Institution speaking about a long-time topic of interest in his work, career, and life, gelatinous zooplankton of the sea. Dr. Madin received his AB from the University of California and his PhD from the University of California in 1974. His research interests are the topic of his presentation tonight: the biology of oceanic zooplankton, the distribution, energetics, and behavior of pelagic tunicates and ctenophores, comparative life history of planktonic animals, hydromechanics of swimming and buoyancy, in situ techniques for zooplankton research. Have I used any words that people don't understand? I think you'll get it. He spent much of his career searching the ocean for translucent animals made about 95% of water. You'd think that they might be very hard to find, and sometimes they are, but sometimes there are great numbers of them. Dr. Madin is a senior scientist at the Woods Hole Oceanographic Institution, and he serves as the director of the Hui Ocean Life Institute, where he's helped to develop and support research programs on marine biodiversity, ecosystem functions, conservation, and technology. Jellies are one of his core passions, but by no means the only work he's done, but that will be the topic tonight. Thank you very much for coming.
Oh, thank you, John. It's a pleasure to be here at the aquarium, and seems like a good time to talk about jellies because there's a wonderful exhibit just across the plaza that I hope that if you haven't seen it, you will see it before too long. John's description of my research interests sounded a little technical, but I want to tell you that tonight is going to be only a little bit lecture and a little bit travelogue, and we won't talk about too many of the details of hydrodynamics of swimming behavior this evening. But what I would like to do is tell you something about what is really the largest habitat on Earth, the largest habitat in the solar system, in fact, which is the waters of the open ocean. And what most of us living here on the land parts of the Earth don't realize, or have an opportunity to realize, is that the creatures that live out there are extraordinarily different from what we're used to. They really are almost as alien to us as we can imagine something on another planet might be, because they have lived and evolved in a watery world which is very different in most respects from either land or even the near-shore environment near the beach and the coral reefs where there's something solid to live on. We're talking about animals that live in a world that's entirely water in all dimensions. Now, of course, the reason that we and everything else exist here on Earth is because this is a planet that's covered by water, 70% by water. And it distinguishes it from everything else in the solar system, but it is this watery environment which constitutes about 98% of all the living space on the planet. And it is this watery environment in which we are familiar with the larger and more visible creatures. Everybody thinks of the whales and the fish and so forth that live in the ocean. And these are the top, generally, of the food chains, the top of the resource pyramid in the open ocean. But beneath that is a great variety of much smaller and less well-known organisms, the organisms of the plankton, and including some of the gelatinous things that I'm going to talk to you about tonight. Now, just to orient ourselves as to the ocean, this is a cross-section of the Atlantic Ocean, and we're over here in Boston where the Hancock Building is more or less to scale with the depth of the ocean. The width, of course, is not really to scale because it's quite a few thousand miles across from here to Europe. But the ocean is bisected, in a sense, by a deep ocean mountain range, the Mid-Atlantic Ridge, that I'm sure familiar with. And then the part that I'm going to be talking about is all the water. And the water can also be divided up into different depth, into different life zones that are based on depth and based on the penetration of light. So the top one of these is what we call the photic zone, up at the very top there. This is the about top 200 meters or 600-700 feet, which there's enough sunlight penetrating to support photosynthesis. So all the plant life in the ocean, the algae that we call phytoplankton, lives in the upper part of the ocean where there's enough sunlight to make it grow, and that is effectively the source of all food in the ocean for all other animals is the plant life that lives up there, just as on land the ultimate source of food here is photosynthesis. Below that is something we call the midwater zone that extends to a depth of about 1,000 meters or about 3,000 feet. And this is really defined as the depth to which light penetrates enough that animals living there can see it and can tell whether it's day or night. Light drops off as you go down deeper in the ocean, and at a depth of about 1,000 meters, there's not enough daylight left to see. But within that range, animals that are adapted to that environment and to those light levels can tell if it's day or night. And this actually triggers a very widespread behavior among ocean animals called vertical migration, in which the animals that live down deep spend their daytime down at depth where it's dark, and the nighttime coming up into shallow waters where there's more food available. That's a topic for another time, but I'll just mention that that's the largest movement of animal life that occurs on the planet. And it occurs in the oceans with all kinds of animals, from fish to squid to little shrimp, moving up and down every night within this midwater zone. Now below that is the rest of the ocean, the deep sea, below a depth of about 1,000 meters. The average depth of the ocean is between 4 and 6,000 meters. So we are talking about most of the ocean from 1,000 down to maybe 6,000 meters depth, down to over 20,000 feet in depth. And that is the part where there's no light, it's dark all the time, it's cold all the time, and that is an almost totally unexplored part of our planet. We have explored perhaps 1 or 2% of the water column of the ocean, and almost nothing has been explored below the depth of the midwater zone that you see there. Now, people have gone and looked at things on the bottom of the ocean, and I'm sure that if you've seen Volcanoes of the Deep or some of the other films about hydrothermal vents, you know that there has been exploration of really exotic and fascinating things going on the very bottom. But the in-between part, all that blue, is essentially unknown territory. Now, most of us, I'm going to be talking about jellyfish, and we'll get to the definition of what we mean by jellyfish and jellies as we go along. Most of our familiarity with the ocean is something like this, and probably our familiarity with jellyfish is something like this. These little things that are stranded, washed up on the beach. If you're a kid, you probably play with them, pick them up, throw them at your friends. If you're the kid's mother, you probably say, don't touch that, don't go anywhere near that. And this is many people's view of what jellyfish are. We frequently see these here in the summer in the Northeast. How do people find out about what they're like in real life? Well, the first step that we might take to exploring these animals in their natural environment is the sort of conventional one of going out on a ship like this with a big net that we pull behind the ship. This is called a midwater trawl, which just means it's a large fishing net that is about 6 feet across and about 15 feet high. And it catches a lot of stuff. And we pull it through the water, we bring up, and we get a tray full of things like this. And if you look here, the big purple blobs are jellyfish. The red things are shrimp that live in deep water. There are some fish here. There's a squid up in the upper left corner there. And so you get sort of a picture of what might be living down in this part of the ocean. But the other thing you notice about this is that all these animals are dead when they come up. So you're not going to learn anything about their life processes. You can't do any experiments with them. And they're all pretty beat up to some extent. The jelly animals in particular get beat up pretty badly. They don't survive the capture process very well. So this has never been a very good way to study living animals that fall into this jelly category. What we've done instead over the years, beginning some 30 years ago, is to take a more direct and simple approach. And people who study coral reefs in the ocean do it by going diving on the reefs. Up until we started to do this, nobody had really thought about going diving out in the middle of the ocean in order to study the plankton that's drifting by. Part of the reason was everybody thought the plankton was too small and you couldn't see it, but many of these animals we're talking about tonight are actually quite large, and they're very easy to see in this way. And the other problem is with diving in the middle of the ocean is there's no bottom, there's no land anywhere around you, and so it's a little disorienting to be out in the middle of essentially a boundless blue sea in every direction. But it turns out to be a really wonderful experience. I recommend it to the dive club folks who are here. And it's a great way to study these animals in their natural environment. The only safety requirement is that we have these ropes that you see here to tie the divers together so that nobody drifts off and washes up someplace in Portugal. What are we going to see? What are we talking about when we're talking about jellyfish? The typical thing that people think of a jellyfish is what we technically call medusae, or medusa is the singular, medusae the plural, named after the Greek mythological Medusa, who had hair made of snakes, and which I guess resembles the tentacles of these jellyfish. And this is mostly what you're going to see in the exhibit over at the aquarium. Medusae are fairly simple animals. They belong to a group of animals called the cnidarians, which also include corals and sea anemones. And these are characterized by the fact that they sting. And that's what most people know about jellyfish, is that they sting. They have special cells called stinging cells, or nematocysts, that they use in their tentacles to catch their prey by stinging it, actually injecting it with a toxin. And this is characteristic of all these animals. So these are predators that catch the prey by stinging with their tentacles. They have a very simple body plan. They have a simple gastric cavity or stomach up inside. They pull things up in with their tentacles. They digest them. The remains sort of get spit out. And they swim in a very characteristic way. Like many other gelatinous animals that we'll see in a moment, the jellyfish, and this is another type, a somewhat smaller jellyfish, swim by jet propulsion. And this is accomplished by a couple of steps. They have muscles around the sides of the body that pull in and contract. And then there's a hollow space in the center. And when these muscles contract, it forces water out the back end. So that comes out the back where the tentacles are there. And that has the effect of causing the animal to swim in a forward direction. So jet propulsion was invented by these things hundreds of millions of years ago, before the first human rockets were built. And it's a very common method that these animals can use to swim around. The characteristics of these things is that they really are mostly water. If you take the bodies of these animals and analyze them, they're about 98% water and 1% salt, and the rest is, organic matter of some kind. They don't have any bones, they don't have any claws or scales or hard parts or teeth or anything. So everything has to be done with sort of soft tissue. There's where the nematocysts come in, because they work great on killing almost anything that's the right size. And that's why jet propulsion is so good. They don't have to have arms and legs and bones. They can just swoosh water out and propel themselves along through the ocean. Now, jellyfish come in all different sizes and shapes. This is the thing called the moon jelly, which is a really common species around here. You'll see it on the exhibit. You'll see it sometimes in the harbor, in Boston Harbor in the summer, up and down the coast of New England. It's an example of a jellyfish which doesn't really sting too much. People frequently ask, well, how come some jellyfish sting and others don't? And the reason is really that they all sting, but some of them either have more stinging cells or they have nastier stinging cells. And humans have a threshold for what they can feel. So there are some jellyfish that are powerful enough for us to feel them and get stung by them, and others that are not. Many jellyfish are tiny, and if you pick them up in your hand, you'd never feel a sting. But if you were a tiny crustacean or a copepod that's the prey of these animals, you would definitely feel it. Another thing that some of these jellyfish do is obtain their nutrition by symbiosis, by a photosynthetic symbiosis. This is common in corals. I think I'm making a lot of rustling noises with this microphone, so I'm going to take it out of my pocket. Common in corals, as you may know, but some of these jellyfish, like the ones in this picture, the gold-colored material you see are the cells of algae that live inside the tissues. They act like plants, essentially. They generate food by photosynthesis, and then that gets shared by the jellyfish. So it's an animal that's sort of half plant, half animal. The worst jellyfish, fortunately, does not live here, and these are the animals called the sea wasps or box jellyfish. And the one in the picture here is the deadliest, one of the deadliest animals in the sea. It's called Chironex. It's the box jellyfish that lives in Australia. Bad stings from these can be fatal to humans, and they're extraordinarily unpleasant. As I said, it doesn't live anywhere near us. We do have some relatives of that jellyfish, that do live in our waters, usually offshore. They're not something you're likely to encounter. They're called box jellyfish, or cubomedusae is the technical term, because the body shape is sort of square, and they typically have 4 tentacles, one on each corner of the body. There's another very interesting feature about these animals. Now, I need to preface this by saying that jellyfish have very simple nervous systems. They don't have a brain in the sense that we think of it. They just have kind of a network of nerves that control their functions. But these jellyfish have a very complex structure that is shown in the middle picture here, and this is their eye. Many jellyfish have a simple sort of a photoreceptor type eye which tells them if it's light or dark. These jellyfish have an eye, and you see it in the center picture here. The large round thing on the lower part is an eye that has a lens and a retina, much like our eye, and forms an image. It has 3 other kinds of eyes also. Nobody's quite sure what the purpose of this is, and it's very unclear why an animal that has no brain would have an eye that creates an image. People are still researching this question, so there are mysteries that remain. All right, here's something else that a lot of people think of as a jellyfish, the Portuguese man-o'-war. Many of you perhaps have seen these if you've been in the beaches in Florida or in the Caribbean. They also wash up. They're a lovely sort of bluish color. They float on the surface of the water. These are actually related to jellyfish. They're a group of animals called siphonophores, and they have what you might call a colonial structure. They're made up of separate parts, and each part has a specific function in the life of the animal. Now, the Portuguese man-o'-war, if any of you have encountered these in an unpleasant way, you know it's a nasty, stinging creature. It's one of the worst stinging jellyfish that we would encounter in our waters, certainly. Fortunately, we don't see it in New England very often, but it has this float that enables it to float on the surface of the water, and then all these tentacles, stinging tentacles, that hang down below. So the tentacles can extend, when they're fully relaxed, to a length or depth of 20 or 30 feet below the surface of the water. This is what they look like when they're pulled up. It's like a lovely chain of strings of pearls and beads, but if you poked your finger in there, you would really regret it. They feed on young fish, larval fish, juvenile fish typically, and interestingly, they also have associated with them a species of fish that lives in amongst these tentacles as a symbiont, as a sort of a neighbor. And that fish managed to avoid getting stung, but by living amongst those tentacles, much like the clownfish, like Nemo, the clownfish in the anemone, gains some protection from other predators. Now although these are what we call siphonophores, related to jellyfish, they're not the typical type of siphonophore, and I want to show you what one of those looks like. This is not something you'll see on the beach or floating at the surface, because these are now animals that live only down in the water itself. But they too are made up of separate components, specialized units that have particular functions. At the top of this one is a little gas float, a little bubble. Now, we saw a really big bubble on the Portuguese man-o'-war, enough to keep it floating on the surface. This bubble isn't that big, and essentially what it does is float it so that the animal knows which way is up. The bubble is always going to be up. Below that bubble, we have what are called the swimming bells, and these are units which are like little jellyfish themselves, whose only function is to provide locomotory power. So they contract, they provide that jet propulsion power, and that drives the entire unit in one direction or the other. So that's their sole function. And then below that, we have what are called the feeding polyps, and these are the little parts of the animal which actually collect the food. They have the tentacles, they catch the prey, they digest the food, and then that digested food is distributed throughout this entire colony so that everybody gets a share. These kinds of siphonophores come in all different shapes and sizes. Some of them look like little rocket ships, and in fact they really are. This is what you might call a two-stage rocket ship. It has two units here, and each one of them provides jet propulsion, and the tentacles that you see in white there trail out behind to catch the prey. Here's another similar one that's a larger version, in which the jet propulsion comes from those big rounded units in the front, and it can trail behind it a little chain, actually quite a long chain, of individuals that catch the prey and digest it. And if this were life size here, that chain of its individuals would pretty much stretch to the back of the room around here. So there can be quite large organisms. In fact, here's a video of one that was 40 feet long that we saw while scuba diving. Individuals of this species that live in the deep ocean can be as much as 150 feet long. That's a good deal longer than a blue whale. So in some sense, these are the biggest animals on Earth, except they're very, very thin. And they're essentially a long chain of little individual animals that collect food, lots of tentacles, and then way at the front is what you might call the locomotives that by their jet propulsion pull the whole chain along behind them. Now, we're now going to move away from what we might call the true jellyfish, those organisms that belong to the phylum Cnidaria, which is the stinging-celled animals. And we're going to talk about what are sometimes called comb jellies or ctenophores. And these are things which superficially look very much like jellyfish. We have a couple of common species in our waters here. One of them is this one called Pleurobrachia, sometimes called the sea gooseberry, because the body of the animal over here is about the size and shape of a gooseberry or maybe a small walnut. And these are animals which also collect their food with tentacles that you see here, but they typically just have two long tentacles. And the tentacles have branches on them that are called tentilla. So it's essentially an animal that creates a fishing net in the water. It spreads this fishing net out into the water. Small animals come along, and instead of being stung by stinging cells here, they simply stick to the tentacles. The tentacles have something called glue cells, and or coloblast, which means glue cell in Greek. And so something bumping into it will stick to these things, and then the tentacle, all the tentacle that you see here, will get pulled up, and the prey that's caught on it will be transferred to the mouth of the animal. So this is one of the ways that these things catch their food. They're also predators. They feed on the same kinds of things that the jellyfish do in a somewhat friendlier way, you might say. You can swim through a cloud of these and you'll never get stung. And if you I'll get to that in a moment. This is another variation, another species of that type of ctenophore, and I'll just try to explain what's going on here. The tentacles that you see are the sort of squiggles of string there on either side. They're much simpler tentacles than the one we saw previously. And what these animals do is actually, instead of catching tiny animals for their food using sort of a fishing net, they throw out these long tentacles and they latch onto something very big, a very big prey item. And what you see here is that very large prey item, which is a series of sort of orange spots here that extend up into the body of the comb jelly. And the comb jelly is engulfing a prey item which is much larger than it is itself. Because these animals are made mostly out of water, they don't have any bones, they can stretch. They're like the blob. And they can stretch and they can engulf and they can eat things that are much bigger than they are. This means they only have to eat every now and then, of course. And it's one of the wonderful adaptations of being an elastic-bodied animal. Some of the other types of comb jellies that we have around here and elsewhere in the world's ocean don't have the big external tentacles. They have a rather different kind of feeding mechanism and feeding biology. In the summer, along our shores here, we have a very common comb jelly called Nemiopsis. And certainly down in places like Woods Hole Harbor, in Narragansett Bay, these can be so numerous in the spring and summer that the water is practically full of them. And they're very brightly luminous, and if you're at the beach at night sometimes in the summer and you see bright blue-green flashes in the breakers, it's probably these animals. These work a little bit differently. First of all, I want to say something about their locomotion. I talked about how the true jellyfish swim by jet propulsion, and we don't generally see that in the comb jellies. Instead, we see a propulsion mechanism that is based on these what are called comb rows, which are the rows that extend from one end of the body down to the other, and they are made up of a series of essentially little oars or paddles. These oars or paddles are made of cilia. Cilia are like very fine hairs fused together, and they vibrate back and forth. And it's very much like those row of oars on the old Roman galley ships, all paddling sort of in synchrony, and that causes the animal to swim one way or the other, depending on which way they're paddling. Now, one of the things that people often will notice about these comb jellies is these bright prismatic colors, rainbow colors there. Those are made because the structure of these comb plates that make up the little paddles, is so fine that it breaks light up into the colors of the rainbow when light shines on it. Now, there's another source of color here that I want to show you in a moment, but first let me tell you about these two long strings. These are not tentacles that are used for catching food in this case. These are tentacles that are what I call alarm tentacles. So when this animal is swimming along, these tentacles normally would be trailing out behind it. So they would be trailing out behind over to the left there. And we believe their function is that if something sneaks up on this, some predator sneaks up on this animal and bumps into one of those, it's like a tripwire, like it sets off an alarm. It alerts this comb jelly that there's a predator there, and it then goes into its defensive action. And that defensive action is quite interesting. It does involve swimming away as quick as it can, which isn't too quick for these animals, but they do their best. But it also involves a decoy. And the decoy is that the little red dots that you can perhaps see running down some of these comb rows. You see the little row of little red dots? Those are not prismatic colors. That's not created by light diffraction. Those are actually little drops of a luminous material, a luminous ink we might call it, inside the jellyfish. And when something sets off those alarm tentacles, it releases that ink as a cloud in the water. And if it's nighttime, it's like fireworks. It's a bursting cloud of blue, green flashes of light. And while that's going on and the predator is trying to figure out who set off the fireworks in its face, this animal is swimming quietly away. This is just the same thing that squid and octopus do. You may be familiar with it, squid ink. And so here we have a very interesting analogy in a very distantly related, almost totally unrelated organism of that defensive mechanism. So how do this kind of comb jelly catch their food? Here's another one, and these are called lobate ctenophores because they have these large structures called oral lobes that they spread out. And they also have structures here called auricles, which are like little whip-like things that wave around. And what happens is the animals swim through the water very slowly towards you as if it were coming out of the screen. And those little whip-like auricles are moving around. And other little animals that get in the way get confused and frightened by this oncoming behemoth. And they swim in such a way that they get stuck on these oral lobes. And then the oral lobes fold up around them and trap them, and they are then transported quickly to the mouth of the animal. So it's a wonderfully effective mechanism for just slowly cruising through the water and trapping small animals as you go without ever having to stop. Some of the comb jellies are predators on other comb jellies. This is a species called Baroe. There's no common name for it. And it swims around and bumps into other comb jellies, and when it finds them, it uses that same trick of its elastic body, and it just expands so quickly that it sucks the whole animal inside it and engulfs it. This animal is basically a swimming stomach. There's almost nothing else to it but mouth and stomach. And it bumps into something, it opens its mouth very wide, and whatever it is, it can be 2 or 3 times as big, and it takes the whole thing in. There are other comb jellies that are in the shape of ribbons, ribbon animals. This is one whose common name is Venus's girdle. And you can imagine what a poetic description that is for a transparent, gossamer, belt-like structure as much as 3 or 4 feet long that swims through the water. And it's so fragile that it's almost never collected by any conventional collecting methods. So it's only by diving that we can see these animals and see how they function. So some of these jellyfish are shown in this video here. They're really quite, I say jellyfish, but I mean comb jellies, sorry. And some of them can be pretty quick. Here's one that can actually swim in a different mode. It doesn't have to use those comb plates I was telling you about. It does have them for slow swimming, but can also flap and escape in the way that you just saw. Now I want to switch to another category of jelly animals. These are things that probably you will not see washed up on the beach, although it has happened in recent years, and they are not related very closely at all to what we've been seeing. In fact, these are animals which are more closely related to us as vertebrates than they are to anything that has gone before here. These are animals called salps, which are free-swimming, filter-feeding organisms that live in the open ocean. And by filter feeding, I mean they swim through the water, they create a current of water, and they take out of that water the phytoplankton and the other small particles that they use as a food source. Now, there are many interesting things about them that I will touch on briefly, The one in this picture here is an animal that's probably about 3 inches long. They range in size from about 1/4 of an inch to a foot in length. So they're not insignificant. They have a mouth at one end. The body is a hollow, tubular, barrel-like body. There are some muscles around the body at the top that enable it to contract, and that results in causing water to flow out the back end, and that creates jet propulsion, just like we saw with the jellyfish. Totally different kinds of animals, same kind of swimming. Now, the other thing interesting about these is their reproductive biology. They have the best of all worlds, you might say, as far as reproduction goes. What you see here is an animal that reproduces asexually. It buds off a chain of babies. It's like a chain of paper dolls. It's a whole bunch of baby animals all connected together, all produce the same. They're genetically identical. It's like triplets gone wild. And there may be 100 animals in that little chain. And what we will see, but before we do, I just want to remind you that this pumping action causes water to be passed through the body of the animal in the path that you see here outlined in blue. So the water comes in the mouth, it passes through the animal, and we'll see in a moment what happens as far as collecting food and goes out the back end to cause the animal to swim. So here's the whole story about the life cycle of these animals. The one we just saw in the last picture is up at the top. It's what we call the solitary animal because there's just one of them. It makes this little chain of babies that we saw. And that little chain of babies eventually breaks off and swims off on its own to experience life and so forth. And at the time that it does that, every individual in that chain is a female. So they're all the baby girls' salps. As they grow up, each of them develops inside a baby, which we call an embryo. And it is, in fact, attached to a placenta, and it is, in fact, nourished by the mother's circulatory system. Is this sounding familiar? I told you they were related to vertebrates. This is actually probably sort of coincidence, but that little baby growing up inside that you see at the bottom, you can perhaps see there's a little one inside the big one there, will then be born and grows up to be the one that we saw first, the solitary stage. Those mothers, after they've given birth to the baby, switch over and they become males. So they start out as females, they spend the rest of their lives as males. The other part of the life cycle, they're neither. So every type of reproductive strategy is seen in this particular species, this group. Some of these chains of the salps drift around like this for months, picking up crabs as hitchhikers perhaps, or here's one of the mama salps with the baby inside, attached inside. And here's something that illustrates a little bit more about the locomotion and the feeding. I said that what the animals do is create a water current that goes in one end and out the other. And so what we see is in green, the water in this case has been dyed with some green dye, so we can see it. So it comes out, it creates a little jet of water out the back end. It's really a lot like blowing smoke rings. If you see these things swim through the water, it's like they swim along with a little series of smoke rings puffing out the back end, and that causes them to swim forward. But in the meantime, inside their body, they're taking particles out of the water to feed on. They're taking the algae cells out. And they use a filter for this that's made out of mucus. Mucus is very important to these animals. Mucus is not such a popular thing in our lives, but for these animals, it's absolutely essential. And they create a filtering net inside the body. All the water passes through that. And you can see here perhaps that it's a reddish color. That's because some red particles have been introduced into the water here. They have been trapped out on this net to show us where the net is. Otherwise, it would be invisible. So they have a wonderfully efficient method of catching particles as they swim through the water. Those particles and the net that has caught them all go into the stomach that you see at the back there. And then the net result of the water jet is that the animal swims in a forward direction off to your left. Here's a shot of some of the another instance of a solitary salp that's giving birth to the chain of babies. The one we saw before, they were sort of coiled up around the bottom. This is a different species that sort of extrudes them out the back end, one after another. So you can see there's about 3 of them coming out, and if you look carefully inside, you can see there's more of them coiled up inside, ready to come on out. Sometimes the chains of the baby salps are formed up into little wheels like this that are all attached together and swim. They may get dragged along by the big one there for a long time. That's sort of the mothership up there with all the little the other landing craft below it. And there are even chains that take the form of a double helix, and in which the salps are put together like pieces of a three-dimensional puzzle, and they swim through the water in a kind of a spiraling motion. Now, I should mention that in some species, these salp chains can be 30 or 40 feet long and contain hundreds of animals. Some of them are, as I said, are like wheels, like this. And some of them act essentially like apartment buildings. Now, what we're seeing here is a close-up view of a bunch of these salps that are connected together in a chain. And if you look carefully inside, the little orange things that you see, some of them are small shrimp, and some of them are small fish, which have taken up residence inside these animals. The salps are essentially big, jelly-like, hollow bodies. They don't have any real defenses. There's a whole food-collecting mechanism inside there, conveniently arranged for visitors like this to come in and take advantage of. So there's a whole category of these animals that live inside the bodies of the salp. They take some of the food as it comes along. They get tired of that, they can nibble on the salp. Many of them will raise their babies inside, use them as a nursery. And so a big chain like this could have dozens or even hundreds of other animals living inside it. So they really are floating condominiums. Now, some of the work we've been doing has been on very dense population biology, and I hope you can see some of these sort of ghost-like shapes. These are chains of salps that occur out in the waters off of the New York coast here in the summer. This is one of the densest populations of these animals that occurs anywhere. And this is all done by diving work, scuba diving work at night, where we can get in the midst of these incredible swarms, tens of thousands of animals everywhere you look. They can be they cover a distance, an area in our offshore waters here of about 100,000 square kilometers that are filled with this population of animals pretty much every summer. They have some interesting relatives, and I'm not going to, there'll be no quiz on the names here, by the way, so you don't have to worry about that. But there's some other animals that are similar to salps called doliolids. And I would include these here because they're very reminiscent of what we saw before with siphonophores. You recall with siphonophores, they were made up of special units, some for swimming, some for food collecting. We have the same thing in these doliolid animals. We have what's called the nurse up in the front. And what this does is propel the whole colony by jet propulsion. It's also a jet-propelled animal. And it pulls all these other ones behind it, just like the siphonophores did. And then what we have here in this chain are the little feeding individuals. They're called trophozoids, which means feeding animals. And they don't sting. They're not predators. They filter feed. They collect algae, much like the salps do. But then they share the food. The food is all contributed to the whole colony. Here's a closer view that shows how all these little units are connected together, and there's a sort of a complicated plumbing system that connects everything up so that all the digested food gets distributed. So there may be thousands of little individuals making up these colonies, and the colonies might be about that long, and sometimes they are so extraordinarily abundant that the water is just full of them. Now, I mentioned that there are some critters that live inside these animals, the apartment house of salps. Here's one that takes that to a really special degree. This is a crustacean. It's a sort of a shrimp-like thing called an amphipod, and it's a little hard to make out, but there's a head to the right end. You see the sort of pointy claws and things. It's like a really nasty-looking crab, and it's living inside this sort of barrel-shaped thing. And this little barrel-shaped thing it's living in, which is technical term for this is a barrel, was made from the body of one of those salps that we saw earlier. So this critter will attack one of those things. It'll kill it. It'll eat parts of it. It'll kind of remodel it and reshape it and fix it up a little bit. And then it moves in and lives in it. And it's open in the front, open in the back. It can stick its head out. It can stick its tail out. But the main reason that it does this is because this is the nursery for this animal's babies. It's going to have a brood of babies. When they're born, they can't swim. It's going to take them a while to get big enough to be able to swim. So they need something to live on. And that's what this barrel is for. It's for those babies to live on until they grow up to where they can swim. Okay, now I just want to refresh our memory about where we are. Everything that we've been talking about up to now has been stuff that we can reach by scuba diving in that top photic zone, that top 200 meters. So we don't really scuba dive to 200 meters for those of you in the club, but it's basically things in the top zone. Now, to get down deeper, to look at what's in the midwater zone, we can't do that by scuba diving. So to go there, we've got to use some other technology. The first explorations of that deep water zone were done back in the 1930s by William Beebe in something called the bathysphere, which you see on the left side here. That's William Beebe climbing out of it. It was a little bit awkward, as you can imagine, to get in and out of, but it was a steel sphere that they hung down on the end of a cable off the island of Bermuda to a depth of about a half a mile, and made the first direct observations of life down in the deep ocean. This was pretty exciting stuff in the 1930s, I can tell you. We have improved on that technology a little bit. Now, over on the left side, we have a diving suit, which is called the WASP suit, and it is really kind of analogous to Beebe's bathysphere because it's lower down on the end of a cable, and it has one person inside there, and you can look out through the top, the clear top there, and you've got these sort of arms make you look like the Michelin Man to manipulate things with. But an even better approach is to use something like the submarine or the submersible that you see on the right side here. This is called the Johnson Sea Link, a submersible that's operated down in Florida. And it is not fastened to the surface. There's no cable, so it can swim around, move around freely. And it has been an extremely valuable and productive tool for the exploration of this part of the ocean. It has special equipment that lets us take pictures, lets us collect the animals and bring them back. Another approach to doing this kind of work is using a robot vehicle, what's called a remotely operated vehicle, or ROV, which has no people in it. This is an example of one that is located out in Monterey, California, but it will go down. It's remotely controlled by somebody at the surface with the little joysticks and watching on a TV screen what it does. And it can actually do many of the things that a submarine with people inside can do. And it has the advantage that you're not all cramped up inside like this. You're sitting in a relatively comfortable ship, and you can go off and have lunch and things like that. But it will enable you to bring back and collect a lot of animals that live in the deeper part of the ocean. So what do we see if we're going down to that part of the ocean? It's very similar in many ways and very different in many other ways. We see animals in the same general groups, the same categories. We see other jellyfish, we see other ctenophores or comb jellies, we see other siphonophores, but they're generally all different species than the ones that live up shallow. They're adapted in various ways to living in the deep water. And remember that we're now in a part of the ocean where it's pretty dark most of the time, there's a little bit of light, and where there's relatively less food than there is near the surface, and where some of the animals are going to be migrating up and down during the day. When we were up near the surface, most of these jelly animals we saw were transparent. You could see through them pretty much. That's a good defensive strategy when you're living up where there's a lot of light. If you're more or less invisible, predators aren't going to be able to see you. We don't see that so much down in deep water. We saw a lot of animals that are colored. They're red, or they're brown, or they're black. And that's because there isn't light, and so at least there isn't much light from the sun. And what light there is going to come from luminescence, because most of the animals that live down there make their own light. They're bioluminescent. And the light that they make is typically blue-green in color, and that color of light is very strongly absorbed by red and black and brown. So animals that have those pigments will absorb that light and appear invisible rather than reflecting it. So we have a similar strategy, but we use different kinds of pigment to accomplish it. What about reproduction of these animals? How do they reproduce? If you're a boy jellyfish and a girl jellyfish down in that deep sea, are you ever going to find each other? I mean, what are the odds? So there are other strategies that they have evolved, and one of those is they just sort of make more babies. We talked about how the salps make these babies by budding them off. It's an asexual process, no partner required. The same is true of some of these jellyfish, and those little sort of suction cup-like things you see in the middle there are baby jellyfish that are being budded off by this deep-sea jellyfish that failed to find a mate, and so perhaps resorted to this strategy. One of the things that we find when we go down deep in the water with one of these submarines or with one of these remote vehicles is that it is full of species that nobody has ever seen before. And this really isn't surprising because these animals are very fragile, they're fairly sparsely distributed, and all of the conventional means that we've had in the last 150 years for sampling down, taking those big nets down that we saw earlier, and scooping things up and bringing them back, those are not suitable means to collect and find these animals. They're too fragile. They'd be destroyed. Or they're too sparse, and you wouldn't have much chance of catching them. Or if you did get a piece of it, it would be so damaged that you wouldn't recognize what it was. But by going down with the new technologies that enable us to see what's there and enable us to collect it and bring it back alive and intact, we find all kinds of things. So I would say in the last 30 years of this kind of work with submersibles, there have probably been 50 or 60 new species of jelly-like animals that have been discovered, and more are happening every day. It's almost true that every time you go down in one of these vehicles or send one down, you see something that you've never seen before. So these are just some examples of new kinds of jellyfish that have been discovered in the last few years. Some of these deep-sea jellyfish are pretty big. This is one that's about dinner plate size, very dark red pigment. You can see, that tangle of tentacles. You can see why they were called Medusa. It looks like a nest of snakes. And these are animals that prey probably on fishes and large crustaceans. They probably only catch something to eat once every week or two because there's not that much down there. They have to wait around until something gets close enough to bump into their tentacles. Now, talking about big jellyfish, the really big jellyfish live in the deep ocean. We do sometimes get jellies about this big up here in cold water, but down deep in the ocean, we have things like this, which is 3 feet across and 3 feet high. A new species that was discovered from a submarine some years ago, and in more recent years, we have found 2 other species of the same kind of thing, and these are very strange jellyfish. The deep sea jellyfish frequently don't have any tentacles. So what are they doing? How are they getting any food? These jellyfish are like big plastic bags. They're very thin, they're very flimsy, they have no tentacles. What are they doing to catch food? Well, we don't really know exactly, but we think they might be acting like traps. We think they might be hanging around in the water with a big, big mouth opening and waiting for some dumb animal to swim up inside. Because we know that when that happens, when they get stimulated by something swimming up inside, they shut their mouth down, like pulling the drawstring bag on your garbage bag, pulling it shut. And that would trap that animal inside. And once it's inside, there are some little tentacles up in there that could catch it probably and sting it and convey it to the mouth. So we're not sure, but we think that's what's happening. They just kind of lay around waiting for something to be dumb enough to come swim into their mouth. Now, I just want to mention that on the lower left down there is a little critter, a little crustacean. It's actually an isopod, which is related to pill bugs or sow bugs that we have on land. And every one of these jellyfish, these strange big floppy jellyfish, has one of those little bugs living on it, riding around inside it. And we like to think of that as being the pilot, but I'm not sure that that's really true. I think it's just a convenient place for the animal to live. But it's an example that in the deep sea, animals like that crustacean find it much easier to find somebody to live on, to latch onto. You don't have to swim all the time. Let the jellyfish do the work. And besides, you're probably going to benefit from some of the food that jellyfish eventually catches. The comb jellies, the ctenophores, extremely numerous down in the deep ocean, new species that nobody's ever seen before. Some of them, like this one, really big. How can they be so big down there? There's not much food. What are they eating? They can be so big probably because they're mostly water. And they may also be 30, 40, 50 years old. We have no idea how long it takes them to get so big. But by being so big, and because they use their body surface to catch their food on, the bigger you are, the more surface, and the better able you are to catch some food. So there's an advantage in being able to grow that large. And it's possible to grow that large because the deep sea is a very quiet, still place. If this animal were someplace where there were currents and tides, it'd get torn to shreds in seconds. It would never survive. Down in the deep sea, none of that happens. Nothing moves. Or if it moves so slowly that these animals are not bothered by it. So it's a place, and this is why we sometimes think it is analogous to outer space. It's like it's weightless. There's nothing impinging on these organisms, nothing preventing them from growing quite large size, just like those jellyfish you saw, for long periods of time. They probably don't have predators, or not very many predators, and so you end up with things evolving like this. More new species of comb jellies, all described and discovered in the last 10, 15 years by people going down and looking. There are some other weird things down there, getting away from jellies. There are worms like this. This is a worm that is a transparent and gelatinous worm, about a foot long, that swims along with all of its little legs, providing propulsion. There are sea cucumbers. Most sea cucumbers, for those of you familiar with them, live on coral reefs or on sandy bottoms, and they're kind of sluggish animals that come out at night and eat mud. And we have them in the deep ocean too, and they do go down to the bottom, and they do eat mud and sand, but then they swim. They swim in a very elegant way up into the water column, probably to avoid predators that are cruising along the bottom. Here's another little pair of dancing bear type sea cucumbers that also swim up off the bottom. And then finally, although these are not strictly jellyfish, we can't leave our visit to the deep ocean without thinking about cephalopods, squid. This is one of the types of squid that you might find in the deep sea. I'm sorry I don't have any pictures of the giant squid. I would love to be able to show you that. Nobody has any pictures of the giant squid. And one of these days somebody will see one alive, and I don't know if it'll be me, but that'll be another story in itself. But most of the squid we see are, in fact, quite small, about that big or smaller. There are some the Humboldt squid that you fairly often see in deeper waters about like that, but most of these guys are pretty petite. This is not actually a squid. This is an octopus. Most people think about octopus living on the bottom, but there are a number of kinds of octopus that live in the water column. This is an example of an almost totally transparent one, as you can see. And this is an example of an octopus which has really a very ingenious adaptation in terms of bioluminescence. Where most octopus have the suckers on their arms, and I imagine you're familiar with, what you see here in these white dots is where those suckers would have been. But in this octopus, these have evolved into light organs. That is to say, they're little lights, and they glow. The theory behind this is that this glowing array of lights all converges and leads into the octopus's mouth. And so any animal swimming by that sees this sort of lighted sign and is curious about it and comes over to investigate and follows, it's like following the landing lights at the airport. You follow them in and bingo, it's the octopus's lunch. And I want to just finish up with this critter, which is neither a squid nor an octopus. This is something called the Vampiroteuthis infernalis, which means the vampire squid from hell. And it is an exotic deep-sea creature. It's got gorgeous big blue eyes, as you can see. For a long time, these were known from only a few dead specimens dredged up from deep water. And in recent years, they've been found quite commonly in deep water by people using submarines and submersibles. And they're now so common, in fact, that at the Monterey Aquarium in California, you can buy a stuffed plush toy of this species, formerly rare and exotic cephalopod. So I'd like to conclude there and be glad to answer any questions. Thank you very much.
Lecture and sharing your pictures with us. I mean, I've seen so many things that, like others in the room, probably have never seen before. My question is, how do these recent discoveries and your work over the years, how does it impact ocean science generally, environmentalism, ecology? What are you hoping to learn? Because you said you didn't know a lot about the feeding habits, there's so many unknowns with jellies, and how do you think are they a bellwether sort of?
That's a big question. Thank you. That's a good question. I think there's several ways in which we can answer that. One is, I mean, there's simply a sort of a knowledge of life on Earth aspect to it. is that we are now beginning to find out what it is that has evolved to live in various ways in this the largest part of our planet, things that we really didn't ever know were there before. So it's analogous in that way to the hydrothermal vent discovery, where we discovered entirely new and previously unknown ecosystems. This is also a relatively unknown ecosystem, and we're now beginning to learn who the players are in it. That does also help us to understand the evolution of other forms of life in the ocean. But we think that probably there's other aspects to it, and one of them has to do with the cycle of matter and energy in the sea. And that, in an indirect way, ties into larger global cycles. The ocean is very intimately connected with our atmosphere and with the Earth's climate. And part of that connection is the transfer of carbon in the form of carbon dioxide from the atmosphere into the ocean, where it's taken up by photosynthesis. It's made into the tissues of plants, and then by being eaten by animals, the tissues of animals. And to some extent, that material, that carbon, gets turned back into carbon dioxide and goes back into the atmosphere, but some of it also sinks down deeper and deeper in the ocean in the form of other animals and dead bodies and so forth, and leaves the system and becomes part of the deep ocean sediment. Now, this has always been going on, and all of these animals that live in the water column play a part in that process. It's of more concern now because now we're in a period where we're much more concerned about what's happening to carbon dioxide in the world. There's more of it in the atmosphere. It appears to be changing our climate, and we're very much more interested in what role the ocean plays in regulating that. How much can be taken out by the ocean? So although the animals and the systems and the ecosystem that we've been talking about here is not on the front line, you might say, of that kind of investigation, nevertheless, what goes on between the surface, where that carbon is made into plant material, and the bottom of the ocean, where it is buried essentially for an eternity and no longer plays a role in the climate, what goes on between those is the place where all these creatures live. So what they feed on, how they interact with each other, what their metabolism is, all of those are questions that ultimately we'd like to know more about in order to interpret this. So there's at least two aspects. There's kind of the diversity and history of life aspect, understanding life on our planet, and there's the cycle of carbon and other nutrients and what the relationship is to climate. Yes?
So you mentioned that some of these jellies have colors in an area where color would not seem to be an advantage. Do you think? And then they find ways to luminesce to disguise the color. Do you think these creatures came from an area closer to the surface where the color was an advantage, and they adapted to this other darker environment?
Probably.
What do you think is the advantage in the color?
Right. Yeah, that's a good question. We really puzzle about this a lot, and I think the color is very closely associated with the fact that there is luminescence. Okay, the ones that live near the surface, some of them are luminescent, some aren't. When you get down deep, almost everything is luminous. Fishes, jellyfishes, worms, bacteria, squid, practically everything is luminescent. But the interesting thing about the luminescence is that it must be an important thing for them because they all do it. And we're still trying to figure out just exactly why they do it. There's a dozen or so possible uses for it, possible functions for it. But it's a dangerous thing to use because if this room were completely dark and none of us could see each other until one person lit a match, and then everybody would know where that individual was. And the same is true in the deep water. It's all dark, and as soon as one animal turns on its luminescence light for some reason, whatever it might be, that animal has given away its location to all the other animals. And I should remind you that everybody down there is a predator, pretty much. You know, there's no plants to eat. They're all looking for prey. And those that have eyes are going to respond to any kind of a light signal like that. So an animal that can produce light may have a good reason for doing it, but it has to be careful about doing it. And I think that some of the pigmentation, some of the coloring, because it absorbs the light, helps control that. And one example is that many of the animals, jellyfish, comb jellies, worms, squid, fishes, have pigment that's concentrated around their stomachs, around their guts. And we think the reason for this is that if they eat something which is luminous and take it into their stomach, and that prey item is glowing inside their stomach, if they were transparent, they'd be lit up like they had a light bulb inside them. And it would have the same effect. They'd be given away by the fact that they had a luminous lunch to any other predator around there. So that's why we believe they have pigment that is to shield that light, to keep it from escaping, essentially. And we've done measurements that show that those pigments absorb light in that frequency range specifically. So it's a coevolution of the production of light and its use for various purposes, and the pigmentation to help control it, keep it from making trouble, you might say. Yes?
Do they leave any fossil record, and is there anything like this biologically?
Fossil record, as you might imagine, is quite scant. There are fossils, even Precambrian fossils, that appear to be impressions of if a jellyfish settled on the mud and decayed and left a print. There are things that are like that. There are some other, almost all of these, if they leave any fossil, it's some kind of an impression like that. So there are things that could be jellyfish that go back to the Precambrian more than 600 million years ago. There are things that could be comb jellies that go back to Devonian, I think. Most of the others, there's relatively little fossil evidence. The other approach to understanding phylogeny, of course, is by genetic evidence. And most of these things go back to pretty close to the early origins of life, if you do it that way. Yes?
There's a small article in Sunday's New York Times, kind of disturbing to the general reader about the dimming of the Earth. This had to do with the amount of light that reaches through the atmosphere to the Earth.
Because of particles in the atmosphere.
Yeah, it had to do mostly with the jet stream, the disturbances caused by the jet stream. It seemed wildly varying degrees of temperature that happened just during the post 9/11 period of time, where usually you read about temperature changes being very moderate over long periods, and this was very dramatic over a short period of time. Do you all, with Hubble, is that a factor that's known about for a long time, and what impact?
Well, it has been known about in a sense for a long time because there have been natural events in history that, like Krakatoa and things, or even Mount Pinatubo, 20-some years ago in the Philippines, that put so much dust in the atmosphere that it affected temperature. Yes, that's certainly part of the equation of looking at global climate. It's hard to tell at this point what the impact of those changes is going to be on the ocean. We know that changes in climate in air temperature will eventually translate into some changes in water temperature. Changes in water temperature will have some biological effects, certainly animals, it'll be too warm for them or too cool for them, or it'll affect their growth rate or their distribution. So things that will happen on land in terms of effects on animals will to some extent happen in the ocean also. The other thing that climate changes may do in the ocean is to change the pattern of circulation of how the ocean currents flow. And that in turn can have complicated feedback on the rest of climate. But I would say that we're just at the beginning to understand what climate change effects might be on ocean populations. Okay, I think back there. Yeah. What animals prey on jellyfish? Partly other jellyfish, but among large, sort of higher level predators, sea turtles. Many of them eat exclusively jellyfish or other jelly-like animals. The sunfish, mola mola, is a specialist on jellyfish. Actually, quite a few fishes, it turns out, do eat them at least part of the time, maybe if there's nothing better to eat. And the other source of predation is all these little sort of miniature predators, these little shrimp and crustaceans that kind of nibble on them. So there's a variety of things that, they're not terribly nutritious, as you might imagine. I mean, they're mostly water and salt. and they're kind of spicy. So there's not a lot of animals that make their major diet out of jellyfish, except a few specialists like the sunfish and the sea turtles, and some tuna eat jellyfish also.
Let's just take 2 more questions.
Okay. Okay, way back in the back. Yes.
How do you study free living deep sea cnidarians? Or more specifically, are you able to create perfect pressure swimming conditions for your free living?
How do we keep them alive?
Do you actually bring them to the surface?
Right, the deep living animals we can bring to the surface. And you mentioned pressure, I believe. The pressure is not actually much of a problem here because pressure affects animals that have some kind of a gas-filled space. You know, like if we dive down, our lungs collapse because they're filled with air. Some fishes have a swim bladder full of air, and the pressure will affect that. If they're brought up too rapidly, they more or less explode. And those siphonophores with a gas float. But most of the other animals don't. And so they're basically just water, and so they're not really affected by the pressure change. They are sensitive to temperature changes very often. So we can bring them back up, and then we can keep them alive in a refrigerated aquarium tank for a while. Not successful really in keeping them alive for a long period of time. I mean, places like the aquarium here are much better at that because they've got a whole bunch of people to look after them. So the deep animals are hard to keep. Yeah. Okay, over here.
Do they occur in the far south, like south of the Antarctic convergence and very cold?
Yes, right. Two things. The salps that I talked about, the sort of the movie that showed the swarm of salps. Salps like that are the second most common animal in the Antarctic Ocean, in the Southern Ocean, after krill. And so you have all this krill that the whales feed on. Sometimes there are no krill, and there's miles and miles of those salps. In fact, I'm going down there this November to work on those. The other thing that happens in the Antarctic and the Arctic to some extent is that animals which up in more moderate latitudes live deep in the water, some of these deep sea animals I've showed you, come up and live near the surface in Antarctica because the temperatures are similar. It's cold, at the surface or down deep. Also, the Arctic and Antarctic tend to have part of the year they have very high productivity, so there's a lot of food being generated. So you do get some of these big jelly animals in the Arctic. Also, there are jellyfish that are this big around. Productive.